When we say due diligence as an organization and as a quality professional, like, what does it bring to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, when I try to explain due diligence to my stakeholders, oftentimes these are people in sourcing, merchandising, and I'm really walking through new products that they're introducing to me. I think due diligence is really asking the questions about what's most important about how that product is going to function, and as well as understanding all the various intricacies that sort of go into sourcing and manufacturing certain products. The conclusion I usually kind of draw to them is that it's really about evaluating all potential outcomes and risks that could occur with sourcing a product like that, manufacturing a product like that, and then use for at least our role in quality and compliance. Our role is to really kind of look at all the potential risks that could affect the value of that product at the end of the day, whether it result in quality or some design element that could affect the end purpose, the function of the product at the end of the day. I mean, for us, I think the biggest importance, you have to have a product that works, but for the sort of the compliance hat and that quality safety hat, you're looking at all potential safety risks that can come out of it. Oftentimes, it relies on sort of the experience of the people in those industries, kind of leaning on that tribal knowledge, if you will, whether it be from quality professionals or people actually directly involved in the manufacturing. And I find it most challenging when we're working with people that are less familiar with how that product's actually made. They may be responsible for sourcing and developing a product like that, but the limit to their knowledge sometimes ends at the point where we get to step into the factory. And then from there, they were challenged in trying to figure out, okay, well, where do I get this additional information? Who do I go to? I see merchandisers, buyers go to the supplier, but oftentimes on the supplier side, they're talking to sales reps. And so for me, and I'm like, no, we need to get to people that are more involved in manufacturing. And oftentimes that leads, it's either somebody in production or somebody in quality if the organization has a quality management team.
Yeah.
And I think when you get to quality management, you kind of are looking at the business side of it, but at the same time, you're also looking into the manufacturer. You're sort of looking at a very broad part of that supply chain. Whereas, then that's the role of quality and compliance. At least it's evolved into that. It was never explained to me as that's what you would be doing. I went to school, I studied engineering, so I understand kind of like the risks that are involved in technical aspects, but then stepping into sort of like a retail environment or e-com environment, you suddenly find yourself having to have those conversations. What is the business goal, right? Well, in order for you to meet your business goal, these are all the technical elements that feed into that ultimately lead to that product. It seems like a simple topic, but I find it's very nuanced, which makes it challenging, right?
So that's very interesting because the way you look at due diligence is it's the ability for an organization to really assess the risk across the board and really do whatever it needs to do to go back to the root causes of it and ensure that all of the check boxes are checked, kind of thing.
I think really drawing it out, mapping it out across the board is really the only way to be able to properly explain it. Because as we're having this conversation, if you were a merchandiser or a sourcing person, you'd be like, okay, I still don't grasp, like, what do you mean? And so what do we mean? We start to draw out what are the industry standards that sort of determine that product should be that product, right? And then you look at, from a safety authority perspective, what are the risk elements that we are responsible for that sort of go into that? And then, supply chain, right, in terms of, managing your WIP, work in progress, and then coordinating that with all of the quality control pieces that you have to have along the way. And you'll see like raw materials or, inspections, quality control happens here. You also have to do material testing. All these little elements, you sort of pencil those in across the map. And you workflow that and you say, okay, well, these are going to feed into it. We can't continue the process until we ensure that raw materials are good. We test the product, that the raw material in terms of mechanical or chemical safety comply. Otherwise, do not pass go from that point on.
So it's almost like when you look at your end-to-end, And the question becomes what all these stop signs are, like where do they need to be put so that everything gets truly checked as well, like as your product goes. If something isn't checked, then there needs to be some sort of mechanics and process to address it. So that due diligence for you in terms of, like I say, as an organization, ensuring that you define the steps along the way that need to be checked, all of these little checkpoints and targets and validation that need to be put in place, and making sure as an organization that you do everything. So what I wanted to share with you, because I thought about it before our conversation too, and I've been looking at due diligence through the lens of the legal framework, and you touched a little bit on it. But the idea for me as well, when I talk about due diligence and when I used to talk to the business about due diligence, is I see another kind of scale, which goes from, let's call it high mandatory and low, let's put it low mandatory standards. And I look at it from the angle of where your requirements that you're going to use to put along your end to end, where do they all come from? On the left side, what you have is, like you say, all of the protective equipment, food, so food requirements, PPE, like all the stuff where you require some sort of certification, testing, that's mandatory by law. So where the law says you have to test your product, you have to register it, you have to let us know, blah, blah, blah. And then you've got all the standards that are coming from an area of, let's put it as industry standards, where the law doesn't really tell you what to do, but there's a best practice out there as well, right? So you have different sets of standards, ISO and ASTM and all that stuff. Those are recommended courses of actions to build your standards. And then you've got the next one, to me, is kind of a little looser, and it's your company values. Up to the point where there's maybe no requirements or no standard, let's put it that way. So company values, you've got your internal standards that have just been created by the company itself to really try to make the product better, because that's based on the experience, based on years of doing it, and there's been recalls or claims or whatever. The way I used to explain due diligence to colleagues as well, or other groups, is I said, due diligence is kind of this whole area where the law doesn't require to do it, but as a company, you kind of want to, and the more you move this way to the right, and the more it's like fuzzy, but it also means that in the future, all of that hasn't been defined by standards yet. You need to start considering it. No one's telling you to do it. And so very often what I found myself doing when people were asking, oh, where does this test come from? Or what should we do about this? And I said, there's no standards. There's no one that tells you that you should be doing this way or that way. But we are in the area of due diligence, meaning as an organization, do we feel comfortable moving that way if we don't do what we're supposed to, if we don't test the product against this, or if we don't pull that target or put that target in place, or if we don't do those testings and those validations? And if in 5 years down the road, we get sued or we're being brought to court because of that specific topic, will we feel comfortable actually defending our standpoint and our decisions here?
Mm.
So the way I've used due diligence in the past, it was really about the kind of the scope of things that we want to do as an organization. There's part of it that's the standard, there's part of it that's company established, so we do it, and that's because we want to do it. And then there's like the fuzzy gray zone of like, yeah, we may want to do it because it's coming up as our due diligence, because everything is moving towards a more regulated type of environment. So we need to make sure that we're prepared.
Yeah, I mean, it compartmentalizes, it prioritizes, and it's pretty clear. I think where there's no standard, in between no standard and company values, I think there's an element of experience that goes into it, that goes in there, right? There's no standard behind it, but from our lessons learned in the past, we've had learning from certain product issues, you sort of adapt and then create a standard of your own to avoid that, prevent it.
Yeah, because I think this is the other thing as well. There's this perception or this belief out there that a standard is set, and once it's set forever, right? And that things don't move. But unfortunately, we're dealing with a moving object all the time in quality, right? Quality and compliance, because standards are evolving constantly. Standards and regulations, and you kind of have to go ahead, make sure that you're ahead of the wave permanently as well. And so I think this is where this whole experience phase here is so important as well, because all of the little projects that you do here, they're eventually going to start going this way as you start experiencing, and they're going to move into the area of, yes, this makes sense. This needs to be company values and company internal standards. And then eventually from there, they might also move into the industry standards. I like that idea of like experience or experimentation phase, actually.
Yeah.
It's all about trying things out and making a decision as to what timeline are we playing with those specific standards. I think what it seems to show to me is when we talk about due diligence, there's two dimensions to it. There's really the idea of what do we need to do and then ensuring that you're doing it, right?
You know what would be great? I mean, I love this illustration, is if there would be a way to kind of overlay the amount of risk that you end up taking depending on the direction you take. But I know it differs between each of those categories, between law, standard, and values, because high mandatory standards that are law, that would increase your safety, reduce your risks, ultimately as low as it could go, but it's often not the case. And so I think we expect that. I expect that if it's something that really can reduce our risk completely, then the law should be sort of that standard that everybody gravitates towards. And that would take the guesswork out, wouldn't it? Whether it be law or industry, right?
So do you mean that by following the law, if you follow this to the T, the amount of risk that you have is only covered by, let's say, 70%? There's a component of due diligence that comes on top of applying that standard that you still have to do as an organization. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that makes sense. From the various categories I've worked in, I think that's a pretty close estimation.
Yeah. So the bottom part of that risk is what I call it covered, but I'm not sure that's the right wording for it. Or if it needs to be more of a exposure, I guess.
Or unknown.
Or unknown. The more that unknown risk is prevalent as well, right?
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I wonder if there's other concepts that we can tie to that as well somehow. Because I think the other thing is the more you move to the left, like to the very regimented, regulated, there's a higher level of efforts that you have to put in place. Like you have to be super precise, and that it requires a higher amount of manpower to maintain it too. Accuracy, maybe that's a better word. Not that you shouldn't be accurate in like those other areas, but I think in terms of maybe effort is a better word than accuracy. But you kind of have to be more diligent about making sure that you follow those too.
Right.
So maybe that's the concept of diligence.
That makes sense. It's like when I think that I look at effort would be like how much quality management effort you put into it, right? And that's directly to how much companies invest in those resources for a quality management team. You know, within the automotive industry, highly regulated.
Yeah.
Incredible amount of due diligence, as well as incredible amount of resources they put into their teams to managing all that because of the amount of effort that's involved. it isn't an easy way to do it. This image here is a telling story to anyone starting out
Yeah.
and wanting to bring a product to market. I mean, this, if anything, illustrates, the amount of due diligence that you want to put into it and the risk that you're going to cover yourself by investing. But that's more testing, more documentation, more sophisticated systems to be able to document and have
Tracking
the
audit.
data, right?
Yeah. Because you need to be, there's your process, there's your check on your process, there's the check on the check of the process,
Right.
having proper reporting as well that's put in place. And most of my career I've been fairly safe product. I haven't dealt with medical equipments where the risk of injury is a lot higher, but or airplanes or cars or things like that, where there's definitely a very high level component of safety in it. And so sometimes I'm trying to like put things back in perspective to make sure that, especially on the footwear, like it's a pair of shoes. Okay. At the end of the day, it's a pair of shoes that you're making. You never, someone may get an injury out of it in very, very isolated cases, but most of the time it's a fairly safe industry. You've dealt with a whole bunch of different products, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in office supplies, furnishing. I've worked in writing instruments, papers. As I look at this, I can see how a lot of the product categories I've worked in can fall into these. The more
Yeah.
complicated the product that we had, the more complicated we got, the greater the risk that we were looking at. Whereas looking at a writing instrument, a pen, the way it functions, it's quite complicated in how it's manufactured, but the risk is not the same.
What was the most complex product you had to deal with?
Shredders. I think shredders, in terms of all the different components that we went into it and all the different safety features that you would have to ensure were working, right? You have your electrical safety, your chemical safety for the plastics. That was probably the most complicated and required the most certifications and testing, right? But at the same time, the risk of the product, if there was any sort of failure, any type of failure modes, were also potentially severe, right? Where you could have fire safety, mechanical safety that then evolves into a fire, motors burning out, right? And then make sure that the entrance was a certain size, prevent things from being inserted that should be inserted to shredders. That was the most complicated, probably what we consider like one of the largest risks that we always had to be aware of, though I would say the number of issues that would come up or would be less. I think the amount of effort that goes into the design and the manufacturing and quality control to oversee all of that helps ensure that you have very few cases if a case comes up.
Were shredder regulated? Did you have standards existing and regulations and certifications that were required or not?
Only on the electrical side, but not in terms of the mechanical safety of it. It didn't have to go through that. There were industry standards, right, that define the opening size of the area, and then industry standards as far as if something got caught, what the load needed to be for it to shut down.
It's actually a fascinating case study because it just, there's so many dimensions of things that could go wrong when you think about it.
And it's a high use, high visibility type of product. It's in your office, your living room. With the amount of mail we get, we were shredding lots of things, and then also with documents, of course. But on a daily, you have mail, and then if you're working from home, you're shredding a lot of things. And then just the variety of different sort of innovations and designs out there. There's so much choice. So, that always kept you kind of going through it. The lifespan of a shredder, unfortunately, wasn't that long just because of the amount of load that you put through it. You're constantly going through this cycle where you're developing a new product to be more innovative or more economical for different load needs, right? Specializing the equipment for sort of the variety of different users that you would have. I think that contributes to how complicated it was because every season you have a new product.
Plastic, you said plastic safety, right? As
Yeah.
well. Yeah. Fascinating case study, actually.
Oh, yeah. And looking at that, then you have what falls under safety. would be all the lessons learned. Say these are all, there's industry standards, there's law governing the safety elements. Then as you launch a product and you get feedback, you realize that there are other sort of lessons learned that we need to include with the next development of a product like that. Oh, and what's the data protection? That's also a very important piece of this, right? How small are we shredding pieces in the shape in a way that makes it, indistinguishable or uncodable, right? People can't go back in and repiece things together. Because I think we started learning about that at the same time. The suppliers of the shredder manufacturers, they're always combing through sort of data protection news. And I think we didn't realize that that was an area that we need to explore until customers' information started getting hacked, right? Not our customers, but you hear in the news that people are, uncovering, credit card information or, financial information by people going out and dumpster diving, pulling these strips of paper out and then just piecing it all together. And suddenly it became something of great importance that we needed to make sure that we were doing it in a way that defining a standard for the lack of a standard that didn't exist, and sort of the data safety.
Yeah, because I noticed on mine there's like a separate slot for credit card as well. So it's like, I wonder if there's like different shredding in the middle that just allows you to get rid of that data. I love that.
And I don't know how many people outside of the shredder industry would even think of talking about it like that. But yeah,
I don't think
you're spot on.
I mean, kid safety as well with this because it's low to the ground. It's like,
yes. So kid safety, you've got mechanisms. You've got lasers. You've got sort of the optical safety element to it. So it would detect if something was inserted that shouldn't be inserted. Then you had sort of load sensitive buttons that if you're inserting your hand in a way which differs from the pressure that you would see from like something that's flat across,
right?
That it would also trip the safety sensors, and then the other safety element would be like it would reverse if it felt jammed, right? You would then try to reverse it out to prevent further damage or damage occurring to the blades, the motors. I think the previous slide is good to kind of like lay it out. These are the categories that you have to explore, right? You ask the question, I'm bringing a shredder to market. So you go through and you look at, okay, what's mandatory? What's high mandatory? Stepwise, you go through all of that and you just figure out, okay, what are the pieces, the risk areas that we need to explore that are governed under each of those. And I think your law, your industry standards will cover a lot of the safety elements of it. If you're a distributor of lots of different products, your company values may not specify the standards that would go into, say, a shredder, right? Every day, it's something that's good quality. Quality is probably that value, right? But then what does quality mean in the shredder that we're going to sell at this price point?
Right.
Right.
But it could be durability as well, because I don't know that this is very necessarily regulated. Like shredder to last 10 years, or across generations or something. And that becomes not a non-regulated company value as well.
I think in the old days, people would give you, lifetime warranties, right?
Yeah.
And then optionally people will say, we'll give you 10 or 5 years, but you need to purchase this warranty. If you're buying it the sticker price, you'll get the manufacturer's minimum warranty, which is coincidentally, according to law, also, a minimum warranty of 2 years, right?
All right. Well, I think we've passed the time, so I'm gonna wrap up. But that is such a cool exercise. I think that was really cool to see where we started. And that shredder example on it is a fantastic example too.
That's fun.
I'm definitely going to use that again.